I can't count how many times in the past decade we've seen a major movie studio announce a shared universe just for it to fail. I always thought it was kind of funny to see them announce like 12 movies before the first one even released, like they knew for sure it was going to be a hit. To me, up until recently, it seemed like this trend of forcing a cinematic universe out of big IPs was dying down, because 90% of them haven't worked. But in the past few months, more and more studios have been announcing plans to expand the universe of their biggest titles. John Wick, Creed, Transformers, Sonic, all of these are franchises that I'm a pretty big fan of, but some of this stuff just doesn't feel necessary, or like it will even last that long in the first place. Hey, I'm James, this is Mixed Up Media, and we're going to be talking about cinematic universes, where they started, when they became so popular, why they fail, and what it takes to make them succeed. Let's get into it. The idea of shared universes in film goes back to the year 1943, with Universal Pictures' Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. 12 years prior to this, in 1931, the studio began releasing their classic horror monster films, beginning with Dracula and Frankenstein. Later would come other classics like The Mummy, The Invisible Man, and Creature from the Black Lagoon. When you look at it on paper, what they did with their franchise seems virtually identical to what the MCU would do over 6 decades later, but it really isn't that simple. The Universal Horror Shared Universe is only a precursor to the model we see so many studios attempting to recreate today. Their approach was vastly different. Frankenstein and Werewolf of London began as completely separate franchises. There were no overarching plot lines or even a hint that their stories took place in the same world. The studio was just making a lot of money from releasing what seemed like an endless stream of horror flicks. Even still, they decided they needed more. Of course, you can pull this off by just making countless sequels and spin-offs. So where exactly did the idea of crossing over 2 of their most iconic characters come from? This is Kurt Siodmak, a late German novelist and screenwriter. According to him, the story goes something like this. One day, he was having lunch with George Wagner, who was a film producer for Universal at the time. Kurt jokingly told George that he wanted to buy a new car and needed a writing gig so that he could cover the down payment. He then proposed a movie called Frankenstein Wolf's the Meat Man.
What?
I know it sounds hella fake, but this was just a mispronunciation that got quickly corrected to Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. Later that day, George called Kurt and told him to go ahead and buy the car because he would be giving him the money for the down payment to write the movie he proposed during their lunch. This monster mash retroactively made it so the Frankenstein and the Wolfman franchises took place in the same world. The following year, they released House of Frankenstein, which featured Dracula, meaning he and his series were a part of that same universe as well. This was done a few more times, and soon enough, it would be confirmed that most of Universal's monsters coexisted in one supernatural, messed up, horrifying world, even though this wasn't the intention at the start of the franchise. When you look for the origin of cinematic universes, you have to start here. But you know, sometimes it ain't about who did it first. It's about who did it right. The MCU might not be the first shared universe, even among comic book movies, but it is without a doubt the most successful and honestly the best executed. It was born from a string of decisions made by Marvel to financially recover from their 1996 bankruptcy. To help pay off their debts, they would sell off the film rights of their most popular characters. Every Marvel cape flick made from Blade in 1998 to the Fantastic Four Rise of the Silver Surfer in 2007 was the product of other studios like New Line Cinema, Fox, and Sony. However, Marvel helped produce every single one of these. With each release, they slowly gained more and more confidence in their own abilities and eventually decided to try out in-house filmmaking for themselves. Before 2008, if you said the name Marvel, most people would think of either Spider-Man or the X-Men, but unfortunately for Marvel Studios, they had access to exactly none of those characters. Their planned MCU was already a big risk, but kicking it off with and centering it around Iron Man, a character who at the time would have most people asking, "Who?" made it even more of a gamble. Sure, The Incredible Hulk was released literally the next month, but it was a financial disappointment, just like the 2003 film. And also, Universal's complicated rights to the character and Disney purchasing Marvel in 2009 didn't help either. But over the next few years, Marvel would continue building out their cinematic universe with the Captain America and Thor franchises, as well as a sequel to Iron Man. These films were tied together by shared lore, common locations, characters, and a hell of a lot of post-credit scenes. Using these tools, they set the stage for their first large-scale team-up movie, The Avengers, which is still one of the highest-grossing films of all time. It dominated the box office and showed that the coordination and planning it took to make something as big as the MCU was actually worth it. And countless studios took note and began attempting to create their own shared universes as well. For now, let's just call this the Marvel effect. The idea of shared universes had, and honestly still has, a good number of Hollywood's biggest studios in a chokehold. They all see their most popular IPs as cash cows they can milk infinite money from through film, TV shows, and merchandise. To some viewers, this might seem exhausting, but you can't really blame the companies behind them or the fans who are along for the ride. The MCU has made over $28 billion since 2008, so this clearly means that something about the idea of a shared universe has been appealing to moviegoers. For starters, multiple productions can be run at the same time, so fans don't have to wait years between releases. Adding an overarching storyline to the background of these standalone films gives fans a reason to see each release, even when they might not be interested in every single one. Personally, I think the biggest plus as a fan is seeing these large-scale plotlines come together and be resolved. The payoff of seeing the Infinity Saga progress, then finally conclude after 11 years and 23 movies, is something I don't think we'll ever experience again. Speaking of the Infinity Saga, I want to give a big thanks to Movie Palette, the sponsor of today's video. Because of them, I am now the owner of this stunning piece of artwork. Believe it or not, this is Avengers Infinity War, like the entire thing. Movie Palette takes the dominant color from every scene of your favorite movies and organizes them chronologically to be placed on canvas. The result is their signature movie barcode that allows you to appreciate your favorite films in a way that you've never seen them. Yes, this is an ad, and I've only had mine for a few days, but I've seriously been loving this thing. On top of being a big movie buff, I'm also kind of an art buff as well, so this movie palette fits right into my space. It's been a huge conversation piece with my friends and family. Every time I've told someone what movie this was, they say things like, "Oh, I think this is the scene where Thanos beats the attitude out of the Hulk." Infinity War is one of my top 5 favorite movies, and I was excited to see that they had the other 4 as well. If you're interested in getting one for yourself, you can use the promo code MIXEDUP15 and get a big 15% discount on any product from their website. Now let's get back to the video. At this point, you could fill up a graveyard with all the cinematic universes that have died out before they gained any traction. I've already discussed Sony's struggles to start their own Spider-Man universe with The Amazing Spider-Man 2, as well as whatever they're trying to do now in an earlier video, which I'll link in the description if you're interested. But let's talk about a few others. In 2014, Universal Studios released Dracula Untold. This was going to be the first movie in their Dark Universe, which would have been a revival of their classic horror monster franchise. It's the same one we discussed earlier, they were just known as Universal Pictures back then. For me and a few of my friends, Dracula Untold is a classic based off the strength of this scene with Vlad's cape alone. But it still wasn't received well by the general audience or critics. During its production, the film underwent reshoots that were done exclusively to tie it into their planned universe. After the movie failed, a representative of Universal tried to damage control, and they made a statement saying that it was never intended to tie into anything at all. What they said was the true beginning of their dark universe was the 2017 reboot of The Mummy. Before the film even released, Universal announced that they were already working on 9 other projects, including titles like The Bride of Frankenstein, Van Helsing, Phantom of the Opera, and The Invisible Man. They even made a fancy logo and released this Photoshop picture of some of the stars that would be leading the universe. Universal's plan was to modernize all of their monsters and make a bunch of action movies to compete with Marvel, instead of sticking to their roots in the horror genre. Rather than being seen as a worthy follow-up to Brendan Fraser's Mummy franchise, it was just seen as another Tom Cruise action flick. His worst one yet. The Mummy was criticized for being stuffed full of material that was only purposed with setting up future movies, and it was just kinda bad. In 2019, Universal released another statement saying that they were throwing in the towel, and that they would again start focusing on individual releases instead. Personally, I'm really glad that they failed because the version of The Invisible Man that we got is actually a great movie. And I'm willing to bet that the Johnny Depp version that we could have gotten would have been all sorts of mid. In 2017 again, Warner Brothers was planning to build their own shared universe around King Arthur: Legend of the Sword. It was going to span 6 movies that followed different characters, and in the end, it would lead to a large-scale crossover. King Arthur was met by an underwhelming critical reception, and was criticized for being a generic action movie that didn't have much of what made King Arthur's story a classic to begin with. I watched the movie specifically to talk about it here, and it was basically a superhero movie for no reason at all. Arthur was fighting like he was Thor when everybody else was just a regular guy. And that's kind of a shame because the more grounded parts were surprisingly good. This movie seems like what happens when you take doing what works too far. I think the biggest mistake the WB made when planning this universe was trying too hard to compete with much bigger franchises. I know that sounds a little ridiculous to say, and I know there is magic in the original story, but in the film it's so excessive that it takes you out of the viewing experience every time it happens. It also doesn't help that the CGI is not that good. Aside from the MCU, the DCEU has been one of the biggest shared universes in film. It kicked off with Man of Steel in 2013, but you wouldn't have guessed this because the follow-up movie didn't release for another 3 years. For some reason, the second film in the franchise is what should have been one of the biggest cinematic crossover events ever, Batman vs Superman. In this one movie, Batman, Wonder Woman, and Lex Luthor are all introduced for the first time. The Justice League is teased, the destruction of this newly established universe is foreshadowed, and Superman dies. It feels like 2 or 3 movies worth of stuff crammed all into one, and critics slammed it for this because there was actually a decent story at its core. Audience reception was mixed as well, and the DCEU got off to a pretty shaky start. The next release was Suicide Squad, which further damaged the growing universe's reputation. Then came Wonder Woman, which was pretty good, followed by the Justice League in 2017. My opinion on that movie is, I'm really glad that the Snyder Cut was real. The main thing that has always blown my mind about the DCEU is the fact that only 2 members of the Justice League got their own movie before they teamed up. That came out in 2017, and we're just now getting the first Flash movie 6 years later. It's crazy that it's a Flashpoint adaptation too, but I do think it's smart that they're using it to do a soft reboot of the franchise. I will say, at least DC's extended universe had some highlights in its decline and didn't just outright fail on its arrival. But there's just so much that contributed to its downfall, like the fact that basically 3 of the first 5 films were crossovers, and all 3 of them were kind of misses. The Justice League should have been bigger than the Avengers, but it came out way too soon. It also had a change of directors and went from a movie that was actually good to a messy one that was plagued by controversy. It's definitely a crime that we never got a follow-up to Man of Steel, but at least we got bangers like the Suicide Squad and Peacemaker. Again, I'm really glad that the Snyder Cut exists as well, but it was basically DC acknowledging that the first one was ass.
Kal-El, no!
One thing all of these failed attempts have in common is bad films serving as the legitimate starting point of their respective universes. The Amazing Spider-Man 2, The Mummy, Batman vs Superman, all of these films are criticized because their quality is sacrificed for the sake of building a shared universe. Stopping the story just to fit in setup for another movie is kinda lame, and even Marvel has been having that problem with some of their more recent releases, but they've been around for a while. Could you imagine if Phase 1 of the MCU went Iron Man, Civil War, Guardians of the Galaxy, Black Panther, then the Avengers? There is no way that we would be on Phase 5 without a reboot somewhere along the line. One of the biggest differences between what Marvel did in the early MCU compared to a lot of the failures is that they took their time. They didn't rush the world building, and most of the setup for future films actually either made sense for the story of the movie it took place in, or it happened in a post-credit scene. At least that's how it used to be. By no means has the MCU been perfect. Even at its height, for every Winter Soldier there's an Iron Man 2 and Thor Dark World, but they've built up a lot of goodwill with the viewers over the span of their releases. It took 5 movies worth of setting up to get to the Avengers. The only main character who hadn't really been developed before it was Hawkeye, and this even includes the main villain of the movie.
And I will not be bullied by
Over the first 3 phases, the quality is fairly consistent as well. Unfortunately for Marvel, nothing lasts forever. Starting around the middle of Phase 4, there seemed to be a waning interest in the MCU. There have been way more releases, and because of that, the quality has been all over the place. Phase 4 lasted 2 years, and it includes 8 shows, 7 movies, and 3 specials. I happily watched all of it, but I don't blame the viewers who are getting tired of keeping up with its excess, especially when they aren't interested in what's releasing. I'm still not really sold on the idea of superhero fatigue really being a thing, but I've definitely felt franchise fatigue myself. I've been a big Star Wars fan since I was like 3 years old, but I haven't watched anything Star Wars related since the Boba Fett show. I heard Andor is amazing, and I plan on watching it eventually, but the only thing I'm really interested in seeing as of now is Season 2 of Star Wars Visions. If you're wondering why I decided to make this video, it's mostly because of the Super Mario Bros. Movie. Not even a day after it came out, I saw this picture of a fan-made movie slate for a Nintendo Cinematic Universe. It has all the most classic titles and ends with the Super Smash Bros. Crossover. I hate being a buzzkill, but this just does not sound like something I'm interested in seeing at all. Mostly because movies about fighting games are always bad, but also because the adaptations for some of these games deserve to be made with a different style than Mario. If I heard a happy song while Samus was literally fighting for her life, I would honestly lose my mind. All of this got me wondering if the age of a major shared universe repeatedly dominating the box office is over. Will we ever see another one as big as the MCU that's not superhero related? Should we even want there to be something like it in the future? What do you think? Let me know in the comments.